Hello and welcome to the FIT4PRIVACY Podcast, the podcast for those who care about privacy. I'm your host Punit and here we have conversations with industry leaders about their perspectives, ideas and opinions relating to privacy and data protection matters. Before we start, a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are not legal advice. So let's get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Punit and I welcome you to the FIT4PRIVACY Podcast, where we have a special guest who's a senior technology executive with experience in business development, software development, creating partnerships, product management, and so on. He's a veteran in several high growth startups. And right now he's helping an organization with a mission to build future of decentralized identity and trusted interactions. He's the vice president at Evernym and his name is James Monaghan. Welcome, James. So James, welcome to the show and help us understand, how did you get into learning or get into privacy? Because that's quite strange coming from a background of software development, product development, and so on. How did you get into privacy?
Well, it's a great question, and thanks for having me on the show to talk about it. I actually think it's most software developers and most technologists' responsibility to learn about this sort of thing, given that we're increasingly working with people's personal data. But you're right; it's often viewed as a separate discipline. And I was actually very lucky. I didn't set out on this path consciously, but I was working at a company called Telesign, which was helping the largest internet companies secure access to user accounts by linking them to a phone number. And my role there was to build products that pulled in other personal data linked to that number, like your name and your address and things like that, to even further increase the security of those accounts and prevent against imposters. But of course, the large internet companies, consumers are very sensitive about the way they process data. They don't all have the best reputation for doing that. And so we at Telesign, we wanted to make sure that safe handling of personal data was a strong differentiator for us. We wanted that to be really one of the pillars. So our CEO created the role for a chief privacy officer and brought in a guy named Stephen Bollinger, who was very experienced. He used to do a lot of the data privacy stuff for Microsoft when they were launching Office 365. And so he set out a whole program, a whole roadmap for how Telesign could go about building a strong privacy practice. And one of the elements of that was he put in place a program where any member of staff could get a IAPP certification. That's the International Association of Privacy Professionals, if your audience don't know that. And so I chose to pursue the CIPT, which is the Information Protection Technology Certification.
Right.
And it was a great opportunity to really take a little bit of time out of my day to day and really focus on that and look at the work I was doing through the lens of data protection and information privacy. And even though it wasn't a particularly long course of study or things like that, I found that sort of focused effort changed how I think about it permanently.
Good. And now you're in Evernym. And what does Evernym do?
Well, so Evernym's mission is to bring the humanity back into our human digital interactions. When you think about it, the way you interact with businesses and organizations, particularly online, has been really dehumanized. You're reduced to a username and password. You're forced to submit all kinds of personal data just to differentiate yourself from a bot. And we don't think that's right for individuals. We don't think they should have to share so much. And we don't think it's great for businesses. We think that's a bad user experience that leads to distrust and customers not converting. And so Evernym is helping individuals take more control of their personal data by equipping organizations with the ability to issue and consume what we call verifiable credentials, which are little fragments of a person's identity that can be used individually to prove just what you need to about yourself to have a given interaction. So you don't need to give your entire biography and mother's maiden name and all this kind of thing just to prove that you're not a dog. You can actually share only what's required to be able to substantiate the relationship. And it's been a really exciting journey, actually. It's a bold vision, but we're having a great time with it.
It is indeed a bold vision, and we will come back to that. And let me start with a simple question. When you think about GDPR or when you hear about GDPR, what one word comes to your mind?
Well, the one word I think is springboard, actually. And
Wow.
and that's, yeah, I know, because a lot of people would say cookie banners or something like that, but actually, I think it's a jumping off point, right, for establishing these more equitable relationships. And it's, it's not perfect, but I think it's a good example to other regimes about what a regulation with those aims can look like. So I'm actually a big fan.
And then how do you see privacy or data protection in the digital world? You already mentioned about identities and passwords and privacy getting dehumanized. That's the word you used.
Yeah.
So how do you see privacy and protection in the digital world? Because it's getting complex with the big tech having so much of data about us. Somewhere it feels like it's a lost battle, but how do you see it?
You're exactly right. I think it's honestly the most important frontier of this decade. We're subject to unprecedented profiling and data collection. And there are people born in the last few years whose entire digital lives will have been profiled and tracked. And that unlocks fantastic opportunities, right? We have incredible products now that are free because they're monetized through advertising and things like that, and that's amazing. But we've also seen that supposedly benign technology can be used to manipulate public opinion in elections and during the pandemic and things like that. And so I think, consumers are becoming increasingly aware of the risks. Governments are paying more attention. But I think there's a huge opportunity here for companies to follow in the footsteps of brands like Apple, who have made privacy a real differentiator, deliberately. I think that, reframing how you deal with personal data and how you deal with consumers in a more equitable way is going to be a fantastic opportunity for businesses in this decade. So it's really important that we don't get it wrong, but I think it's not all stick. I think there's plenty of carrot there as well. And if companies invest this right, then there's a huge payoff potentially.
Absolutely. And when you talk about privacy and protection, one of the key elements where data gets exchanged is identifying yourself. That is identity management, proving it's me. And you raise a rights request and they say, can I have your ID? Can I have this? Can I have that? And it defeats the whole purpose. If I'm making a rights request, I intend to know what do you have about me, but you're asking me to prove that I am the right person and give me more data. So how do you see these identity management approaches, and how can it be moved to the next level? Because this is very cumbersome. Send me your ID card, or I will send you give me your phone. I will text you, give me a OTP back. That's not ideal in my opinion.
I mean, I would agree with you. I think that process you're describing, it's as if they need to know everything. It's as if your identity is a singular entity, right? It's all or nothing, and that's how it's framed so often. Even to purchase alcohol in the United States, you need to show a driver's license. That doesn't just prove that you're over 21. That has your home address on it, has your blood type in some states. It's got all kinds of personal information. And sure, in a grocery store, people aren't going to write that down, but online, anything you share like that is essentially stored forever. And so I think it's really important to stop viewing identity as a singular thing and recognize that it's about relationships, and all human relationships are multifaceted, right? Who I am to you is different to who I am to my employer, is different to who I am with the customer, is different to who I am with my friends and family. And what we need to prove about ourselves to engage in those relationships should be different. And it's true that for government services, like for operating a motor vehicle, getting a license for that, or crossing a border, there's a common standard that's required that you should have to clear. But for all the other aspects of our digital existence, you should really have to prove only what's strictly required. So I think if you break it down into the different credentials that we used to use before life went digital, right? You have a piece of paper that had your academic qualifications on it. You have your plastic driver's license, things like that you can combine in ways that meet the need of what's required, rather than having to just share the whole lot. And so, the way I look at it, and certainly the way we look at it at Evernym, is if you break that down into different credentials and allow people to combine them in ways to substantiate only the trust that's required, then you don't have this impossible hurdle to clear where you've got to prove everything about yourself. Because the truth is that identity thieves have that information at their fingertips just as well as you do. And it's just going to be a constant arms race otherwise.
Indeed. I think when we look at Europe, there are different identity management solutions in place. Like in Belgium, we have something called It's Me. And what you do is you give your credentials one time, link it to your bank or any other organization. And in future, you say, I want to log in through It's Me.
Yeah.
And you just need to give your mobile phone number, and rest of the identification data, you don't have to. Rest stays with that. So are there any interesting approaches when you say you want to make it decentralized or you want to make it next generation?
Yeah, so I like those. I like those bank ID schemes, like It's Me, and I think people often talk about the Estonian model as well, where there's quite centralized, but it works really well in their environment. And I think it's important to recognize that that's not just a technology solution. And what works well there is the cultural fit. Those are cultures where there's actually generally quite a high amount of trust in institutions like the government, and they exist in an environment with quite strong data protection regulation that means that a service like that could be run centrally and still be well trusted. I don't think that's true in all countries. It's certainly not true. It's getting better in the United States and places like that, but it's not true there today. And certainly when you go outside the US and Western Europe, it's less and less a sure thing. So if we're looking at how do we get internet scale trust, then it almost comes back to what we were talking about a moment ago, where you can't view it as one size fits all. And so when we say decentralized, we're not really saying blockchain, all the things. What we're saying is, don't imagine this one view of who a person is and this one source of truth, this one database where you can look them up. Instead, think about it as the person, as the logical center, and all the different aspects of their life. Imagine that because sort of laid out around them, as opposed to the sort of classical view where you've got the company in the middle and all their users clustered around them. If you take that view, then what's needed in a given domain, like a given country or a given commercial setting, can vary quite radically, and yet you can still have common rails that allow that trust to be established. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just speculating, how would a practical use case look like in that situation? How would the user experience be?
Well, so today, the way most of the schemes that are trying to do that work is they sort of give you this digital wallet experience. So you imagine, quite often it's an app on your mobile phone, or sometimes it's a locker, an account that you sort of log into online, and it's stored for you in the cloud. But typically you give individuals the ability to sort of collect and securely store these different credentials about their life. And then you have the ability for organizations to plug in and either provide individuals with that data. And so that could be anything from a driver's license through to a receipt or a warranty for a purchase that I make. And then you can have the same ability for organizations to request and verify that information. And so the user experience would feel a bit like when you check out online using one of those like a PayPal checkout or pay with Apple Pay, things like that. You would use a second device usually to approve that checkout process. And what's happening there is that the information is being shared sort of directly from your digital wallet back to the relying party that needs to make a trust decision based on it. And that sounds similar to the model today with identity providers like
Exactly.
Google, Facebook, where you sign in with them. But the big difference is, because this information is coming from you direct to the organization, there's no third party in the middle that is able to, number one, decide who is allowed to plug in and who isn't, and two, surveil those transactions. And even if they can't see the data themselves, those identity providers know, which of their users are interacting with which other businesses and things like that. And all that metadata is still incredibly valuable for their, extractive advertising business models and things like that. So the experience is not radically different, but the main thing is that you've actually given the individual direct control of that data, rather than just a username and password to allow someone else to release it for them.
Let me play it back. It's more like the authenticator apps which we are having. So there's an app which collects all your data, but for rest of them, they connect with a say unique identifier to the app, and the ID is identified, but behind it, it's you, it's your date of birth, it's your driver's license, all that remains kind of anonymous. Is that?
That's right. Yeah, you can be pseudonymous for every one of those interactions that you need to, and there's no one unique ID. I'm not, James 123. Everywhere I sign in, I would be a different James, but I still have the ability to prove that I'm a real person, that my name really is James. If I need to. The people I'm sharing that with are able to verify that information is accurate if they trust the source of it, right? So they're not just taking my word for it. They're able to look at that credential and see who was it that issued that to James. So they can tell that it was, say, the driver's license authority, or it was my bank or someone like that. But they don't have to actually phone home with an API or something like that and go and ask them directly. They can instantly verify it as soon as they get it from me because of the digital signature that's on the data itself.
And how does the organization asking the app to validate trust that this is the right one? Because I can, you are James 123. I can also say I'm James 123, but you will not validate it. But how do they know I have not impersonated and created a James 123 myself instead of you creating it?
Yeah, well, so they need to trust the authentication mechanisms that the issuers of those credentials have in place. And so part of whether you trust the credential at all has to do with, do you trust that organization knows who their stakeholders are, who their end users are. So, if there was a credential from my sports club, for example, that says my name is James and I live at this address, you might think, well, how robust are their checks really? Did they actually check where James lives? Whereas if it was a credential that was derived from a utility statement, say, then you could be pretty confident, because if I've been paying the bill for my electricity for a number of years there, then and my electricity company says this is my address, then that's probably quite reliable. And so, again, we don't think there should be one standard for trust, and either you have a good ID or you don't. We think trust is very much in the eye of the beholder. And so if, as an individual, I have at my disposal various different proofs from various different organizations that know me, then a relying party can make a decision as to which ones they'll accept, and I can choose which ones I'm willing to reveal. And of course, in reality, the user experience of that is not like I have to go to my filing cabinet and rifle through all that stuff. My app, my wallet app on my phone will do all that for me automatically. And all I need to do is have a look at my screen and decide if I'm going to approve or deny the request to share that information.
Sure. And I think that also gets more important in the days of pandemic, because in a COVID world, it's more about online identity and everything being validated online. So how does privacy and safety as well, safety gets assured or reassured in this COVID world with the solution that you're suggesting?
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, when you look at how fast the adoption of some of these technologies has accelerated in the last 18 months, it's, as you said, it's getting that balance of safety and, the legitimate interest that governments and businesses, frankly, have to protect the health of their employees or their workers or their citizens against the very real risk of that information being misused, because this infrastructure is new. The sort of companies that are now starting to collect and process what is protected health information, right, either vaccination status or test result status, they're often not equipped to know how to do that in a way that is consistent with the regulation, for like HIPAA, for example, in the United States. So it's very difficult and fraught with risk. And so the pushback that we see against so-called vaccination passports, I think, is justified. People are rightly very concerned that, number one, their liberties will be infringed on, and number two, these solutions are not super robust. To that, I would say these concerns are absolutely valid, and I completely share them. That said, not all approaches to it are equal, and the technology does exist to have that sort of best of both worlds combination, where you've got really high assurance that the data is authentic and does pertain to the individual standing in front of you, along with really high privacy. So selective disclosure, I'm only sharing the attributes that are required in this moment, like the fact that I tested negative in the last 72 hours, for example, nothing else, and non-correlation. And this last one is really important. If you look at a lot of the QR code based solutions that are proliferating at the moment, those are basically a unique ID. I mean, it's literally your QR code. So everywhere you show it, you're being the same you. So you can think of that as a real world tracking pixel, basically. It sort of follows you everywhere you need to show that. And we think that's quite a primitive and harmful approach from a privacy perspective. So if you think, given that we talked about how these smart wallets work a moment ago, you can imagine an approach where instead the place I need to prove my vaccination status or my test result status asks me for it, and I allow my wallet to release that information, but it generates a unique proof every time. And so if I use it at the grocery store, and then later on I use it at my place of work, and then in the evening I use it at a movie theater, there's nothing about those three transactions that would allow some technology provider or nefarious third party to piece together my movements that day. And so that solution is the basis for one of the more popular COVID health pass solutions out there, which is the Ayato travel pass. That's something that we at Evernym have helped the International Air Travel. Say that one again. That's something that we at Evernym have helped Ayato put together. It's designed by and for the airline industry, and it allows you as a passenger to enroll your passport using your phone, go and get a COVID test at a participating laboratory, and then when you're checking in for your flight, you can share the proof that you tested negative along with the passport that's linked to your reservation. And you can do all of that in a way that's completely secure without having to overshare that information. And then later on, as you move through the airport and as you cross borders, you can simply scan a QR code using your phone to authorize the release of that information. And so that's been trialed by over 80 airlines so far. The first one is going live in production later this month. And that same approach is being championed at a larger scale by a group of over 200 companies called the Good Health Pass Collaborative. So they're looking at how do you take these health certificates like vaccine certificates and test results and turn them into smart health passes, essentially, that can be used in this dynamic way that we've been discussing. So a blueprint exists for this, I guess, is the point I'm really trying to make. We don't have to make do with using these QR code based vaccine certificates everywhere. We can convert them into smart passes and then just release the information that's required. And that way you're shielding the individual from that unintended tracking that they would be exposing themselves to.
So if I understand well, there are two levels at which the abstraction happens. Right now, let's say EU has a COVID passport. That's essentially digital information, of course, has a QR code. But when I expose it, I'm also exposing some other information along with it. So if we use the solution that you're suggesting, we would abstract it and we will just have a unique ID saying, yes, this person is vaccinated or not, rather than having all the details. Is that?
That's almost right, except it's not a unique ID for you. It's a fresh zero knowledge proof every time you need to show.
Okay. So it's every time generated differently so that there's no traceability to that same person.
That's
every
right.
time.
Because it's not a piece of paper, right? It's a smart wallet. It lives on, I mean, we all carry these devices. So we've got essentially a superpower in our pocket. So rather than just using the screen to show a static picture, it's using it to generate a fresh proof each time, but it can still be cryptographically verified as being authentic and as having originated with a government issued certificate.
That's interesting. So it's a dynamic on the fly generation of a code every time.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So I was trying to establish difference between what exists and what you're saying. So that's where it's different. Yeah,
because I think, when you're crossing a border, for example, or boarding an airplane, you're going to be perfectly identified in that scenario. I would hope, right? So you're using government issued ID already.
Right.
Your whole details, you're going to be biometrically scanned. There's unique IDs everywhere. So in those scenarios, I don't think there's a big risk of using a government issued static QR code to prove your vaccination status because you're already identified. But as we began this part of the conversation, as we called out in that moment, the risk is that's not the only place people are being asked to prove their status. And if this becomes a feature of our lives over the next year or so, I mean, hopefully not permanently, but certainly over the next year or so, to allow economies to restart while still protecting people, then it's crucial that we don't introduce total surveillance as And so,
like they're talking about in France, at least there was a news article, I don't know if they made it live or not, that restaurants would ask for proof of vaccination. Now, if they start asking, that's fine, but if they start storing, that's where the issue is. And that's where probably this dynamic code can still help, because nobody can correlate it was for me unless and until they come to you or the app which provided it.
Yeah, and people may choose to opt in to being tracked. I know a lot of restaurants and things are quite excited by the ability to build a relationship with their customers on the back of rolling out this kind of technology. And you could say that's a great opportunity, but the individual's got to consent to that. I think it's got to be made very explicit, and they have to have a legitimate choice to say no to it while still satisfying the obligation to prove that they're healthy. And so what this gives them is a new default, right? Whereas the default is still really high assurance, but really, really great privacy. And then at your discretion, you can choose to share more and be contacted afterwards and that kind of thing. And that's fine. But we don't have to accept a world where, in order to have safety, you have perfect surveillance. I think we've proven, both at the technology level, but also at the practical level with the Ayato program, things like that, that actually that's a false trade-off, and you can have both.
Indeed, that's essentially privacy by design. It's not either or, it's both privacy and security that you need.
Exactly, yeah.
Good. So that's informative. And let me now ask you some fun questions. There's no right or wrong answer, but you already answered one. Is it privacy or security? I think it's both. So let me not repeat that. So as an individual, what is one privacy concern you have as a person?
So as a parent of two young kids, I think the biggest concern I have is, I use, like a lot of people do, I use social media and things like that to help my wider community, my family and friends and things like that stay connected, particularly as we all live these geographically dispersed lives now. But I do worry about the trade-off that creates, because without my children's consent, I am providing information about their location, their biometrics, and their state of mind in some cases, to companies that are not going to forget who they are just when they magically turn of age. And so I think about that quite a lot in terms of deciding how much to share and in what context, because it is a balance, I think, to get right.
That's interesting. And would you pay for privacy? Because let's say there's an email or there's a social media account which says, if you pay us, we will not analyze, we will not profile your data. Would you pay for that?
So I would be willing to pay for it, and you could argue I already do by choosing an iPhone instead of an Android device and things like that. I mean, there's other reasons to choose an Apple product, but I would be willing to pay for that, and I think I would like to see more businesses reject the idea that the only way to build a scalable, internet scale business is off the back of advertising and exploiting personal data. I think if your product has sufficient value, then you should be able to command a fair price for it. That shouldn't be unreasonable. That said, the cat is somewhat out of the bag. It's going to be difficult for companies to compete with businesses that are funded by ads, because they make so much money. But we have a fantastic opportunity at the moment with regulation coming into force that makes it much harder for companies to profile people without them wanting them to. And so we could see a bit of a shift potentially in the next few years, where companies who really choose to differentiate on that basis emerge, and maybe consumers will choose it.
Sure. Makes sense. And I think there's always a time to put things back in control, and it's never too late. And if I may ask you,
okay. I do think, though, we as technologists and as privacy people, it's not right to make this the individual's responsibility. I mean, people do need to think about these things, of course, but at the end of the day, it's a bit like the safety features in a car or something like that. People grumbled about seatbelt regulation when it first came in, but we all accept that actually fitting and using a seatbelt is a good idea. I really do think that a new baseline for what is reasonable in terms of use of personal data and informed consent and things like that would go a long way, because where at the moment consumers have to make a choice, have to install an ad blocker, or use Brave instead of Firefox, or things like that. That's never going to reach the mass market, and that's where as great as those products are, regulators have a really important role to play there. By not obviously they can't scupper these economic giants that are generating huge amounts of, well, actually they don't pay much tax, but huge revenues. They can't completely torpedo that, but they can make sure that consumers have reasonable protections and reasonable education as well.
And I think it's regulators laying down the rules, the principles, but it's the organizations that acting ethically and morally, and trying to protect by default. And that also leads to the other question: do you read privacy or cookie statements?
No, I don't know anyone that does.
There are a few people who read, but the point is, as you mentioned, the average Joe or the average person on the street does not understand them. So it cannot be expected they will understand and reject privacy statements or cookie statements. The solution has to be somewhere else, saying you put things which are by default private or secure.
And the reason I don't read them is not because I don't care. It's because I don't have a real choice in those situations. The way most companies today, regrettably, implement those things is, if you want the service and you don't want to spend 5 minutes clicking through options and toggling things off, the only way to get what you came to that website for in the first place is to press accept. And it's designed that way. It's quite coercive consent, and so it's not a true informed optional consent, in my view, because they make it so difficult to opt out, and that is not the intended, as you're well aware, it's not the intended spirit of the regulation, but that is how most people have done it.
I would agree. They make it very, very difficult, even for an expert, to understand what's going on. Forget what a layman, my dad or my mom, would understand, or anybody's.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, what would you say to, if there was a web browser or an app or something that negotiated those things on your behalf? If I as an individual could express a preference, a set of things I'm willing to go with and things I'm not willing to, that then alleviated the process of clicking through all this stuff. I think that might be an example of the sort of compromise you're getting at there, maybe, where I don't have to be perfectly informed as an individual, but companies can still ask me for data, and some of it I'm willing to give. Do you
Exactly
think where that spot is possible?
It's a fair exchange. If I'm getting something in return, I'm willing to share. Like a few weeks back, I started to use a private browser, a private search engine. So now what I do is I use the private search engine when I don't need to, but when I know that I'm following US Open and I want them to profile me, that I'm a tennis follower, that let those news be upfront, I'm willing to share that data. So I still use Google for those things. But for some other things wherein I don't want to see what did I search, why did I search that, and all those things, then I use the private search. So it's a balance. Nobody is against sharing data for valid, legitimate purposes. When you need it, I'm okay. And it's the same thing with the bank. If I'm looking for a mortgage, I'm okay that you profile me for mortgage, but don't contact me if I don't need a mortgage. So that choice and differentiation, if I'm allowed, I would happily choose.
Well, because that's the dream, isn't it? Is it's supposed to be that this is just personalizes services for you, gives you a better experience, right? But instead, how it often shows up is you just have a narrower and kind of more pre-decided experience. There's less serendipity out there because you're not exposed to new things, because actually the highest bidder in a search result is always going to be the person who thinks you're going to click the link. So it's always going to be related to things you've seen in the past. And that's how you get these internet filter bubbles that can influence people's thinking and all this kind of stuff as well. So it's a real shame that the same solutions that can have great outcomes like you're describing, so often lead to real narrowing of choice.
Yeah, and I think personalization is a choice. I want personalization or not, but don't personalize without asking me. I was speaking to somebody and they're building a social media platform which would not profile, and I'm interested how many people would adopt that, because it's still in construction. So it's a Facebook or an Instagram wherein there would be no profiling, and you would get to see. But the question then is, if I log in and you don't track based on what I liked and what I commented on, so I will not be getting that alternate reality that we are used to these days. But how many people would pay for it? Because they're actually going to ask people to pay for it. And that's where the differentiation would come. How many people subscribe?
Yeah. Well, because the value in social media is not whether the news stories you happen to see as you scroll through it are relevant or not, right? It's because your friends are there. It's the social bit. And so yeah, I mean, if your friends aren't there, it's going to be difficult for that to be a compelling sort of, again, internet scale offer, but as you say, we might be getting to a point where enough people are aware that there is a true choice to be made, and perhaps services like that will see more adoption in this era than they would have done 5 or 10 years ago.
Absolutely. And another one was, somebody was saying private search queries have increased, especially from Europe after the GDPR. So those are some trends, but are they picking up as fast as the other ones are picking up, wherein there's a lot of personalization, a lot of ads, a lot of tracking, surveillance? No, that's not the case yet. But we've just started with GDPR, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, there certainly haven't been many massive enforcement actions, have there? I mean, it's a regulation that, at least in theory, has significant teeth, but we've not seen anything that's really made a dent in the kind of revenues that these companies make. It's more like a speeding ticket, and so you've got to wonder if it's as yet having the effect that it was intended to.
Well, in my opinion, it is having the impact because we are all talking about it. So that's a shift in the mindset, shift in culture. But if you talk about dent into their pockets, the pockets are so big that it's difficult to make a dent. Even if you issue a 500 million or 100 million fine, the big tech thinks, okay, it was an experiment, we lost 100 million.
Yeah. It's just the cost of doing business, right? Yeah.
That's the cost of doing business. And they look at it as part of testing out the waters and testing out what is doable and what is not. And unfortunate reality is, when they test out on 10 things, they succeed on 3 or 4, and they look at it as a return on investment, even if they are fined 7 times. Because they look at it very business minded, not as some of us who look at it as, oh, they are fined for 200 million. No, that's okay. That was a risk-based approach we took, and there's a fine.
That's true. But we as the creators of the future, basically, I know that sounds really grandiose, but obviously I think people working in technology are, in a very literal way, building the future. We've got a responsibility to bring those values and that culture into the work that we do. And it can't always be, profit first and everything else second. I think we are literally deciding right now what kind of world we're going to live in and our children are going to live in, and it is not a foregone conclusion that will be a world of perfect surveillance by a few giant media companies and large and oppressive governments, right? We have the tools, and to some extent we even have the will to avoid that outcome, and sort of rekindle a bit of what the internet was all about, which was liberating people, allowing free exchange of ideas and all that kind of stuff, where it's okay to make a mistake. That's not going to follow you forever. All this kind of thing. We have that opportunity. But it requires, I think, people to realize that is part of your job, is to think about that. And just like there's 100 different ways to implement most different types of software, you can choose whether you're going to keep some information in a database or throw it away when you're done with it. That's an implementation choice, and I think it's appropriate to always have in your mind the sort of often unstated requirement of, well, whatever we do, let's make sure we're being ethical and equitable with our end users.
Yeah, and there's a shift. If we see, like you mentioned, you're using Apple because of so and so reason, but it's because they invested in it and they make some decisions. Now, those decisions at that time were thought maybe they will impact their business, but they are helping their business. And same way, the way trend is, in a few years, we may see the end of third-party cookies, which will also be a good positive step. So there's a shift, there's a discussion, but we have just started and we're not there where we want to be. So we'll see where we end up. But with that, I will say thank you so much for being with us. But before I say the end, if somebody wants to contact you, what would be the best way?
So the best way is probably reach out on Twitter, where I'm just James _Monaghan. So you can get me there. But you're also welcome to find me on LinkedIn. That's fine too.
Sure. So thank you so much, James. It was wonderful to have you.
It's been a great chat. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening. And now we ask you for some help. Take a moment to subscribe and review this podcast. Your support matters. And if you have done it already, thank you so much. Now, if you have questions or suggestions, drop an email at hello@fit4privacy.com. And finally, if you know someone who will benefit from this, share this podcast with them and help us grow. Thank you so much. Stay safe and see you next time.